The alarm on my wrist pulsed twice before I even opened my eyes, and I knew, in that first half second of waking, that today was the day I could lose my mind and never get it back. My name is Mira Kessler, and 3 hours from now, I would sit inside a chamber built by a species older than human agriculture, and take a test that had never once been passed while the clock was still running. I did not choose this. Nobody chooses this. The compact chooses you, and then you spend the rest of your life finding out whether you were chosen to succeed or chosen to fail quietly, so that everyone else could watch and learn from your failure. I sat up in the narrow bunk of the transport vessel Meridian, my heart already running faster than it should, and I pressed my palm flat against the cold wall to steady myself. Outside the porthole, a station shaped like a broken ring turned slowly against a field of stars, and somewhere inside that ring was a room designed, quite literally, to break minds. I want to tell you exactly how I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. I was not brave. I was not calm. I was a woman who had spent 6 years studying how thought itself works, how people reason under pressure, how minds bend before they snap, and every piece of that knowledge was screaming at me that I was walking into a trap built by people who understood minds better than I ever would. The door to my small cabin slid open, and Owen Voss stepped in without knocking, the way he always did. Owen was the closest thing humanity had to an ambassador out here, a tired man with kind eyes and a voice that never seemed to rise, no matter how bad the news was. "They're ready for you," he said. "I know," I answered. "You don't have to do this, Mira. We can send someone else. We can delay." I almost laughed. Almost. "Owen, there is no one else. You picked me because I was the only one who didn't run when you asked." He didn't deny it. He just looked at me the way you look at someone you are sending somewhere you cannot follow. Let me back up, because you need to understand what this exam actually was, and why every species that had ever taken it spoke of it in hushed, careful tones, the way you might speak about a fire that had once burned down your home. The compact was old, older than anything humanity had ever built or imagined. Thousands of years ago, before humans had even discovered how to write, alien civilizations had already learned how to travel between stars, how to share knowledge across species, how to build a shared community of minds that no single world could ever threaten again. But a community like that needs rules. It needs to know that the species joining it can be trusted with power, with knowledge, with the safety of trillions of lives. So they built the threshold exam. It was not a test of facts. It was not a test of intelligence, not in the way we usually mean that word. It was a test of the mind itself, engineered by the eldest species in the compact, the veil, to adapt to whoever sat inside it. The exam studied you as you studied it. It found the shape of your thoughts, the patterns you leaned on, the logic you trusted most, and then, slowly, patiently, it turned those very patterns into a maze, with no exit. Species had sent their greatest scholars, their sharpest generals, their calmest philosophers. Almost none of them finished. Most stopped speaking partway through. Some stared at the same point on a wall for the rest of their lives, lost somewhere inside a question that never had an answer, because the exam had shown them one that could not exist. And now it was humanity's turn. We had been part of the compact for 11 years by then, always described in their records with the same careful, distant phrase, promising, but unproven. Every other species that had joined had eventually taken the threshold exam and either passed, broken, or simply refused and remained forever on the outside. Humanity had been given more time than most, because honestly, I think the veil found us curious. A species that had barely left its own solar system, arguing about everything, changing its mind constantly, stubborn in ways that made even our allies sigh with exhaustion. I was chosen, not because I was the smartest human alive. I want to be honest about that, because false modesty helps no one, and I do not intend to lie to you in this telling. I was chosen because, in every simulation, every psychological trial, every stress test the compact observers quietly ran on humanity's candidates, I was the one who refused to accept a losing position. Not the fastest thinker, not the calmest, just the one who would not stop. Owen walked me through the narrow corridor toward the transport pod that would take me down to the station, and neither of us spoke for a while. The silence between us was not comfortable, but it was honest, and sometimes that is all you can ask of silence. "You know what happens if you fail," he finally said, not as a question. "I know. The exam doesn't injure the body, it's the mind that—" "I know, Owen." He stopped walking and turned to face me fully, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something close to fear in his expression. Not fear of the exam itself, but fear of what it would mean to watch someone he had chosen walk into a room and never really walk back out. "Then know this too," he said. "Whatever happens in there, humanity does not need you to win. We need you to survive with your mind intact. Passing would be a gift. Surviving is the requirement." I nodded, because I understood what he meant, and because I did not trust my voice enough to answer properly. The pod ride down to the station took 11 minutes, and I spent every one of them staring at the ring station growing larger in the viewport, its surface a strange, pale material that did not reflect light the way metal should. It looked less like something built and more like something grown, the way bone grows, the way coral grows, patient and old, and utterly indifferent to the fact that I was afraid of it. When the pod finally docked, the doors opened onto a corridor, lit with a soft, shifting light that had no clear source, and standing there, waiting for me, were two of the Veil. I had seen images of the Veil before, but nothing prepares you for standing in front of one. They were tall, taller than any human, with long limbs that moved with an unsettling, deliberate slowness, as if every motion had been considered and approved before it happened. Their skin held a faint, shifting pattern, like light moving under still water, and their eyes, if you could call them that, were large and dark and held no visible pupil at all. When they looked at you, you had the distinct, uncomfortable sense that they were not looking at your face, but through it, at the machinery of thought running underneath. "Mira Kessler," one of them said, and its voice carried none of the coldness I expected. If anything, it sounded almost gentle, the way a doctor might sound before delivering news they already knew would hurt. "You may still decline." "I know," I said, for the third time that day, and I noticed my own voice was steadier than I felt inside. "Very few decline," the second Veil said, "and of those who accept, very few finish as they began." I looked past them, down the long corridor toward a set of doors at its end, doors that looked ordinary, almost disappointingly plain for something that had ended so many minds before mine. "I understand the risk," I said. "I still want to take the exam." The first Veil tilted its head very slightly, a gesture that on a human might have meant curiosity, or perhaps something closer to sorrow. "Then walk with us, Mira Kessler. The room is ready." It has been ready for a very long time. We walked together down that corridor, my footsteps the only sound with any real weight to them, and I remember thinking quite clearly that whatever waited behind those plain doors, I would rather meet it walking forward than standing still. The doors opened without a sound, sliding apart into darkness that slowly filled with soft, pale light as I stepped through, revealing a round chamber with no visible edges, no corners, nothing my mind could use to measure the space around me. In the center of the room stood a single chair, and floating before it, waiting, was a shape that would soon become the only thing in my universe. The exam itself, patient, ancient, and already, I was certain, beginning to study the way I breathed. The doors closed behind me with a soft finality, sealing away the corridor, the Veil, the station, the stars beyond it, everything except that single chair, and the silence that pressed in around me like something alive. I sat down. And somewhere far above me, though I could not see it, though there was no visible clock, no ticking hand, no glowing numbers, I felt the exam begin. The chair beneath me was not comfortable, but it was not uncomfortable either. It simply was, the way the exam itself simply was. A shape hovering in front of me, made of soft, shifting light that had no fixed color, sometimes pale gold, sometimes a deep, quiet blue, as if it could not decide what it wanted to look like, or perhaps as if it was still deciding what I needed it to look like. "Mira Kessler," a voice said, and it did not come from any single direction. It came from everywhere at once, calm and patient, like water finding its way around stone. You may begin whenever you are ready. There is no advantage to waiting, and no penalty for taking your time. I almost smiled at that. Of course there was no penalty for waiting. The exam did not need to punish hesitation. Hesitation was simply another door it could walk through. "I'm ready," I said, and the shifting light in front of me steadied, and the first question appeared, not as words on a screen, but as something closer to a thought, placed directly into my mind, clear and undeniable. Here is what I can tell you about the early questions, because I think you deserve to understand what this exam actually does, rather than simply being told it is dangerous and left to imagine the rest. The first questions were almost gentle. They asked me to describe a room I had once stood in, and as I described it, the room appeared around me, built from my own memory, every detail exactly as I remembered it, except for one small thing that was subtly wrong: a window in the wrong place, a door that opened the wrong way. And then the exam asked me, quite simply, which version was true, the room I remembered, or the room now standing in front of me. It sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. Because the moment I answered, the exam adjusted, and the next room it built held two things wrong instead of one, and the one after that held three, until I was standing inside a memory that no longer resembled anything I actually remembered, unable to say with any certainty which parts of my own past were real and which parts the exam had quietly replaced. I want to be honest with you. There was a moment, early on, when I felt the floor of my own confidence begin to shift beneath me, the way it must shift beneath everyone who sits in that chair. Because the exam was not lying to me. That was the terrible cleverness of it. It was not tricking me with falsehoods. It was showing me, patiently, precisely, how easily my own mind could be convinced that something false was true, simply by presenting it with enough confidence and enough detail. "This is disorientation by design," I said aloud, mostly to hear my own voice, mostly to remind myself that I still had one. "You are not testing what I know. You are testing how much I trust what I know." The voice answered, and I swear there was something like approval in it. Yes. Very few name it so quickly. Most spend hours believing the illusion is a puzzle to be solved, rather than a mirror to be recognized. That should have comforted me. It did not. Because naming a trap does not disarm it, and I understood, even as I said the words, that I had only survived the opening. The exam adjusted itself around me, the way water adjusts around a stone dropped into a still pond, rippling outward, finding every gap, every weakness, every place where my confidence had cracks I had never noticed before. The rooms fell away, replaced by something far stranger, a version of a mathematics problem I had once solved as a graduate student, except now the numbers refused to stay still. Every time I looked away and looked back, the values had shifted slightly, never enough to notice immediately, always enough to change the answer. I found myself solving the same problem over and over, each time certain I had made an arithmetic mistake, each time discovering, too late, that the problem itself had quietly rewritten its own terms while I worked. "You cannot trust your senses here," the voice said, almost kindly. "You cannot trust your memory. You cannot trust the consistency of the world in front of you, because none of it is required to remain consistent. This is the truth every candidate eventually faces. What will you trust instead, Mira Kessler?" I sat with that question longer than I sat with any of the others, because I understood, somewhere deep in my chest, that this was the real exam beginning, the actual test beneath the test, and every question before it had simply been the exam clearing its throat. I thought about every species that had come before me. I thought about the stories Owen had told me on the transport ship, quiet and careful, about brilliant minds from other worlds who had answered that same question by doubling down on logic, by trying to build an unbreakable chain of reasoning strong enough to hold against a world that refused to hold still. And I understood in that moment why they had failed, because you cannot out-reason a trap built specifically to exploit reasoning. You cannot out-logic a system that studies your logic in real time and rewrites itself to stay one step ahead of it. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I know I don't have to answer that question the way everyone before me answered it." The light in front of me flickered, very slightly, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw something like surprise ripple through it, though I could not have told you how I knew that, or whether the exam even had something like surprise to feel. It pressed forward anyway, because that was its nature, patient and relentless, moving from disorientation into something colder, a series of statements that were not quite questions at all, but small folded traps, sentences that turned back on themselves the moment you tried to hold them still in your mind, claims that denied their own truth, choices where every path led back to the same impossible conclusion, loops with no clear beginning and no clear end, offered to me calmly, one after another, each one clearly designed to catch a mind that needed closure, that needed an answer before it could move forward. I felt the pull of them immediately. That is the part I think people misunderstand about traps like these. They do not catch you because they are clever. They catch you because your own mind, on some deep and ancient level, cannot stand to leave a question unanswered. It itches, it nags, it pulls at your attention like a splinter. You cannot stop touching, and the exam knew that, and built statement after statement designed entirely around that itch. I felt myself beginning to circle one particular trap, turning it over and over, searching for the thread that would unravel it, and somewhere in the third or fourth pass, I noticed something in myself that frightened me more than the trap did. I noticed that I had stopped thinking about time. I had stopped thinking about the chair beneath me, about the room, about Owen waiting somewhere above in the dark of space, about anything at all except the shape of the puzzle in front of me. That was when I understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water down my spine, exactly how the exam had worn down every mind that came before mine. Not through cruelty, not through force, through invitation. It simply offered a question interesting enough, important enough, urgent enough, that you forgot you were allowed to walk away from it. How long have I been sitting with this? I asked aloud, and my voice came out rougher than I expected. Does it matter? The voice replied, and there was no mockery in it, only a patient honesty. Time moves differently for a mind that has stopped noticing it. I forced myself to breathe. One slow breath, then another, and I made myself notice the chair beneath me, the faint hum of the chamber, the pressure of my own hands resting on my knees. Small, real, physical things, the kind of things a mind under pressure can hold on to like handholds on a cliff face. I'm stepping back from it, I said, more to myself than to the exam. I don't have to resolve it. I only have to recognize what it's asking me to do. I want to tell you it was easy after that. It was not. The exam did not simply accept my refusal and move gently onward. It pressed harder, offering trap after trap, each one wearing a different mask, each one designed to appeal to a slightly different part of my mind, my curiosity, my pride, my fear of appearing foolish, in a room I could not even see. I watched, almost from a distance, as it tried angle after angle, the way water tries every crack in a stone wall, patient and utterly without cruelty, simply doing what it was built to do. And somewhere in the space between one trap and the next, I began to feel something shift inside me that I had not expected to feel at all. Not despair, not fear, though fear was certainly still there, humming quietly beneath everything. What I felt was something closer to recognition, the way you recognize an old argument you have already had 100 times before, the way you recognize a familiar shape in a stranger's face. Because I had grown up, like every human being, inside a species that had never once agreed on anything easily. We argued about everything. We changed our minds constantly, publicly, loudly, and somehow, impossibly, we kept moving forward anyway, kept building, kept surviving, not because we had found the one true answer to every hard question, but because we had never actually needed to. We had simply learned, over thousands of years of stubborn, messy history, how to act without certainty, how to hold two contradictory ideas at once and still get out of bed the next morning. The exam was built by a species that valued resolution above almost everything else. I understood that now, watching the traps fall away one by one as I simply refused to let them hold my full attention. The Veil, and every other species that had faced this exam before me, believed, on some fundamental level, that a mind must resolve a contradiction before it can move past it. Humans had never believed that. Humans had never needed to. You are not attempting to resolve these, the voice observed, and for the first time, I heard something in it that was not quite patience, something closer to genuine curiosity. No, I said, I'm not. Every candidate before you has attempted to resolve them. I believe you, I said, but I don't need an answer to walk away from a question. I just need to decide it isn't the question I want to spend my time on. The chamber around me went very quiet, quieter than it had been since the exam began, and for one long, suspended moment, I genuinely did not know what would happen next. Then the light in front of me shifted, deepening from its restless gold and blue into something darker, something that felt, for the first time, less like an invitation and more like a warning, and I understood, with a certainty that settled into my bones, that I had only survived the first true stage of the exam. The second stage, whatever it was, had not yet begun, and somewhere behind that darkening light I could feel it gathering itself, patient and old and utterly unwilling to let me leave that chamber the same person I had been when I walked in. The darkness in front of me did not stay darkness for long. It pulled itself apart, thread by thread, and reformed into something I had not expected at all, a courtroom, or something very close to one, with tall walls that curved upward into a ceiling I could not quite see, and a single seat waiting for me at its center, facing an empty bench where a judge should have sat. What is this supposed to be? I asked, and I noticed my own voice sounded steadier than I expected, which surprised me more than the room did. A choice, the voice answered, and now it came from directly in front of me, from the empty bench itself, as though something invisible had settled into the seat there. You will be presented with a series of decisions. Each decision matters. Each decision will be remembered. There are no correct answers waiting for you to discover, Mira Kessler. There are only your answers, and what they reveal. I sat down in the single chair, because there was nothing else to do, and the first scenario unfolded around me like a held breath finally released. I stood, in my mind's eye, on a narrow platform between two paths, and the voice described a situation with careful, deliberate detail. A research station, failing, with limited time to save either a large group of strangers or one person I loved. It asked me to choose, and to explain my reasoning, and I understood immediately what it was doing. It was not asking me to solve an ethics problem. It was asking me to reveal the architecture underneath my own values, so it could later use that architecture against me. I answered honestly, because I had already learned, in the chamber before this one, that honesty was harder for the exam to turn into a weapon than performance was. I told it what I actually believed, imperfect and human as it was, and the scene shifted, and shifted again, each new scenario slightly crueler than the last, each one designed to push my answers into contradiction with each other. By the 10th scenario, the exam pointed out, quite calmly, that I had contradicted myself. In one scenario, I had prioritized the many over the one. In another, nearly identical in its logic, I had chosen the one over the many. It laid both choices in front of me, side by side, glowing faintly in the dark air of the courtroom, and asked me, with what almost sounded like genuine interest, how I could call myself a rational being while holding two such opposing conclusions. This was the trap other species had drowned in, I realized, watching the two choices hang there, patient and accusing. They had tried to defend the contradiction, to build some elaborate philosophical bridge that made both choices somehow consistent, and in trying, they had exhausted themselves against a wall that had no actual door. I looked at both choices for a long moment, and then I said, simply, "You're right. They contradict each other." The bench in front of me went very still. "You admit this freely." "Of course I do," I said. "I'm not a machine. I don't run the same equation every time and expect the same result, because the situations weren't actually the same, even if the logic looks similar on paper. Context changed. I changed, slightly, between one scenario and the next, because that's what living things do. You're trying to catch me in a flaw. It isn't a flaw. It's just what it feels like to be a person instead of an algorithm. Then your values are unstable," the voice said, and for the first time there was something almost sharp in it, something testing, probing for a crack. "My values are alive," I said. "There's a difference. Something unstable falls apart under pressure. Something alive adapts under pressure and keeps going anyway. I'm not here to prove I'm perfectly consistent. I'm here to prove I can make good decisions even when I can't be perfectly consistent. Because that's the only kind of decision-making that's ever actually existed, for any thinking being, anywhere." The courtroom held its silence a moment longer, and then, slowly, it began to dissolve, the tall walls thinning into mist, the empty bench folding into darkness, and I understood that I had survived another layer, though I felt no triumph in it, only a bone-deep exhaustion that told me, quite clearly, that whatever came next would be worse. I was right. The next stage did not build a room around me at all. Instead, the darkness simply opened, like an eye, and I found myself standing on what looked like an ordinary street, in an ordinary city, and for one terrible, disorienting second, I believed I had somehow been pulled entirely out of the exam and back to Earth. Everything was too perfect. The sunlight fell exactly the way I remembered sunlight falling on the streets, near my childhood home. The sound of distant traffic, the particular smell of rain on warm pavement, all of it assembled with a precision that made my chest tighten with something dangerously close to relief. And walking toward me, smiling, was my mother. I want to explain something here, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this account. My mother had passed away 4 years before I ever stepped into that chamber, quietly, peacefully, in a hospital room with soft light and a window that looked out over a garden she had loved. I had made my peace with that loss, or at least I had believed I had, in the careful, practiced way you convince yourself you have made peace with something you have simply learned to carry without dropping. Seeing her there, in that impossible street, wearing the pale green sweater she used to wear on cold mornings, undid something in me that I had thought was sealed shut. "Mira," she said, in a voice that sounded exactly, painfully, exactly like hers. "You look tired, sweetheart." I did not move. And I could not move, for a long moment, and somewhere behind my ribs my heart was doing something violent and unfamiliar, a kind of grief and joy tangled together so tightly I could not tell where one ended and the other began. "This isn't real," I said, and my voice cracked on the words, betraying me completely. "Does that matter?" she asked, tilting her head in a way that was so exactly her, so precisely the gesture I remembered from 1,000 ordinary mornings, that for one full second I genuinely did not care whether it mattered or not. I understood, even through the ache in my chest, exactly what the exam was doing. It had studied every room, every memory, every hesitation in my earlier answers, and it had found, buried somewhere in all of that data, the shape of my deepest and most private wound, and it had built a version of my mother out of it, patient and gentle and devastatingly convincing, because it had learned, correctly, that grief is the one trap logic cannot easily defend against. "I know what you're trying to do," I said, and I forced myself to keep my eyes on her face, even though every part of me wanted to look away, to give myself somewhere safer to rest my gaze. "You want me to keep talking to her, because every second I do, I'm choosing this room over the exam, and eventually I'll forget there was ever a difference." "Would that be so terrible?" my mother's voice asked, and even knowing what it was, even understanding with total clarity that this was not her, the words still landed somewhere soft and unguarded inside me. "You could stay a while longer. No one would blame you." I felt tears gathering, hot and immediate, and I let them come, because I had learned enough about myself in that chamber already to know that pretending not to feel something never actually made it easier to move past. I let myself look at her for one more moment, at the careful, aching perfection of the illusion, and then I said, quietly, "I love you, I miss you every single day, and I am not going to spend my last real conversation with your memory, letting an exam use my grief as a leash." The street did not vanish all at once. It seemed to hesitate, as though genuinely uncertain, the way water hesitates at the very edge of a container before finally spilling over, and then, slowly, it folded away into the dark, my mother's image the last thing to dissolve, her expression, in that final moment, unreadable. I sat alone in the returning darkness, breathing hard, wiping my face with the back of my hand, and I felt something new settle into my chest, alongside the grief. Not comfort exactly, something closer to resolve, sharpened by having been tested against the one thing I would have done almost anything to protect. "That was cruel," I said aloud, into the empty dark. "It was necessary," the voice answered, and I thought, though I could not be certain, that there was something almost like regret in it. Every mind carries a wound it will not examine willingly. The exam does not create the wound, Mira Kessler. It only shows you where it already was. That doesn't make it kind. "No," the voice agreed, "it does not." I did not answer that, because there was nothing useful left to say, and the darkness around me began, once again, to shift. What came next was not a room, not a memory, not even a scenario with a shape I could describe in ordinary words. It was simply pressure, a vast, formless weight pressing in against my thoughts from every direction at once, and within that pressure, questions arrived faster than I could fully process them, layered on top of each other, contradicting, folding, doubling back. This, I understood, was the stage where most minds finally broke. Not through one clever trap, but through sheer accumulated weight, question after question after question, with no space between them to breathe, no room to step back and recognize the shape of what was happening, because the shape kept changing before recognition could take hold. I felt my thoughts beginning to fray at the edges, the careful discipline I had built over the earlier stages starting to slip, and for the first time since I had sat down in that chair, I felt something close to real panic rising in my chest, cold and fast and utterly convincing. And in that moment, with the pressure closing in from every side, I did something that I think, looking back, saved me more than any clever answer or clear piece of reasoning ever could have. I stopped trying to answer the exam at all. I simply sat, inside the crushing weight of it, and I thought about Owen's face on the transport ship, tired and kind, telling me that surviving was the actual requirement, that passing was only ever a gift on top of that. I thought about every argument I had ever had with a colleague who disagreed with me completely and somehow remained my friend anyway. I thought about the simple, stubborn, unglamorous fact that human beings had never once needed to fully understand a problem before deciding to keep moving forward through it anyway. "I don't need to answer all of this," I said, and my voice, when it finally came, was smaller than I wanted it to be, but it was steady. "I don't need to solve every question you throw at me. I only need to decide, again and again, that I am still the one deciding." The pressure did not vanish immediately. It took a long, strange, uncountable stretch of time, question after question sliding past me like water past a stone that had finally learned how to stand still in the current, and slowly, so slowly I almost did not notice it happening, the weight began to ease. When it finally lifted completely, I found myself back in the round chamber, the shifting light hovering in front of me once again, calmer now, its restless gold and blue settled into something almost peaceful. "You are near the final stage," the voice said, quiet now, almost thoughtful. "No candidate from any species has reached this point with their mind still fully their own." I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for hours, though I had no real way of knowing how much time had actually passed. My hands were trembling slightly, and my face was still damp from the tears I had not bothered to hide, and every part of my body ached with an exhaustion that felt older than the few hours I had actually spent in that room. "Then let's finish it," I said. The light in front of me pulsed once, slow and deliberate, like something ancient drawing a long, careful breath, and I understood that whatever came next would be the true heart of the exam, the part every failed candidate before me had never lived long enough, in any meaningful sense, to actually reach. The final stage did not announce itself with a room, or a memory, or a voice full of careful, patient menace. It arrived instead as a single, quiet sentence, placed directly into my mind the way the very first question had been, hours or days, or perhaps only minutes before, though by then I had long since stopped trusting my own sense of time. "Prove that you exist." I sat with that sentence for a long moment, turning it over, waiting for the trick hidden inside it to reveal itself, because by now I understood the exam well enough to know that nothing it offered me was ever quite as simple as it first appeared. "That's not a fair question," I said finally, though I already suspected fairness had never been part of the design. "It is the only question that matters," the voice answered, and something in its tone had changed, grown quieter, almost solemn, the way a room grows quiet just before something important is about to happen. "Every candidate who has reached this point has attempted to answer it with logic. They have built arguments. They have cited their own thoughts as proof of their own existence, only to watch me demonstrate, patiently, that a sufficiently advanced illusion could produce the exact same thoughts, the exact same certainty, the exact same conviction of being real. By the time they understand that no logical proof can ever fully close that gap, their confidence in their own mind has already been hollowed out from the inside. They stop trusting their own thoughts. And a mind that cannot trust its own thoughts cannot function. Mira Kessler. Not here. Not anywhere." I understood then, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly what this final stage was built to do. It was not asking me to prove anything at all. It was inviting me into the one argument that no mind, however brilliant, however disciplined, could ever fully win through reasoning alone, because the argument was built to consume any reasoning offered to it, endlessly, the way a fire consumes whatever fuel you feed it. I thought about every candidate before me, from every species that had ever sat where I was sitting, brilliant scholars and calm philosophers and sharp, disciplined generals, all of them reaching this exact point, all of them making the exact same mistake, taking the question seriously enough to try to answer it on its own terms. And I thought about humanity, about every argument I had ever had with a friend late at night, about whether anything could truly be known for certain, about every philosopher back on Earth who had spent an entire lifetime circling that same unanswerable question, and about the simple, almost embarrassing fact that none of us, not one single human being in all of history, had ever actually needed to resolve that question before getting up the next morning and living an entire day anyway. "I'm not going to prove it," I said. The light in front of me stilled completely, and for the first time since I had entered that chamber, I felt something that was unmistakably surprise radiating from it, though I could not have told you how a shifting field of colored light could carry an emotion at all. "Every candidate attempts to prove it," the voice said slowly. "You are refusing the question entirely." "I'm not refusing it," I said, and I felt something settle inside me as I spoke, some final piece of fear finally letting go of its grip on my chest. "I'm answering it the only honest way it can be answered. I can't prove that I exist, not in the way you want. Maybe nothing ever can. But I don't need proof to keep going. I've never needed proof. No human being has ever needed proof of their own existence before they got out of bed, before they loved someone, before they built something, before they showed up for another day. We act. We decide. We move forward under uncertainty, every single day of our lives, because waiting for certainty first would mean never actually living at all. "That is not logic," the voice said, and I thought, again, that I heard something almost like wonder in it now. "No," I agreed, "it isn't. It's something else. It's the thing logic was always supposed to serve, not replace. You built this exam to find the edge of reasoning, and you assumed every mind that reached that edge would either keep reasoning until it broke, or stop entirely, because it had nothing else to stand on. But you never accounted for a mind that would just keep walking, past the edge, without needing solid ground beneath every single step." The chamber around me held very still, and in that stillness, I became aware, for the first time in longer than I could measure, of something behind the light, something vast and old and patient, watching me with an attention that felt, in that moment, almost like awe. "Then answer the final instruction," the voice said quietly, "as every candidate before you has been asked to answer it. Take the exam that lies before you now, and complete it, in whatever form you believe is true." And there, floating in the space where the light had been, appeared something I had not expected at all, a single, physical object, small and solid and entirely ordinary, resting in the air in front of me, a thin, dark tablet, its surface covered in symbols that shifted and rearranged themselves as I looked at them, the exam itself, finally, made into something I could hold. I reached out and took it, and it was solid in my hands, cool and slightly heavy, the first genuinely physical thing I had touched since entering that chamber, and I understood, somehow, that this was the true and final test, hidden beneath everything else. Not another paradox, not another trap, but simply the exam itself, offered to me plainly, without disguise, waiting to see what I would do with it now that all the illusions had been stripped away. I looked down at the shifting symbols, and for one brief, honest moment, I let myself feel the full weight of everything I had just survived. The disorientation, the paradoxes, the courtroom of impossible choices, my mother's face dissolving into darkness, the crushing pressure that had nearly broken something essential inside me. I let myself feel all of it, fully, without flinching away from any part of it. And then I turned the tablet over in my hands and simply held it back out, toward the space where the voice had been speaking from all along. "I'm done," I said. "Here." Silence answered me, a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of sound, stretching on, and I stood there in the center of that ancient chamber, arm outstretched, offering back an exam that had broken every mind before mine, and I waited, my heart hammering, to find out whether refusing to keep playing its game was itself the final trap, or the answer no one before me had ever been brave enough, or perhaps simply human enough, to give. Then, somewhere far above me, in a place I could not see and had no way of measuring, I heard the faintest sound I had heard since entering that room, something like a held breath, finally released. And the chamber began, at last, to change. The dark tablet dissolved from my hands like mist catching light, and the round chamber around me began to brighten, slowly, gently, the way a room brightens when heavy curtains are drawn back after a long night. The shifting light that had questioned me, tested me, and tried, patiently and without cruelty, to take apart the architecture of my mind, folded in on itself, and settled into a soft, steady glow, calmer than anything I had felt in that room since the moment I first sat down. "Mira Kessler," the voice said, and this time it did not come from everywhere at once. It came from somewhere close, somewhere almost gentle, the way a person speaks when they are genuinely moved by something they did not expect to witness. "The exam is complete." I sat very still for a long moment, half convinced this was simply another layer, another illusion, built to test whether relief would make me careless. But the ache in my body was real. The dampness on my face, from tears I had not bothered to hide, was real. The trembling in my hands, which I made no effort to steady, was real in a way nothing else in that chamber had been. "How long was I in here?" I finally asked. "Less time than any candidate in recorded history," the voice answered. The clock had not yet completed its first full cycle. I let out a breath that turned, halfway through, into something between a laugh and a sob, and I did not try to stop either one. "I don't feel fast," I said. "I feel like I've been in here for 100 years." "Time and experience are not the same measurement," the voice said. "You have lived through more in that single cycle than most minds live through in a lifetime. That you emerged with your thoughts still fully your own is not something this exam was designed to allow." The doors of the chamber slid open behind me, revealing the same corridor I had walked through what felt like a lifetime ago, and standing there, waiting, were the two Veil who had greeted me at the beginning, though something in their posture had changed. They no longer stood with the calm, distant patience of beings who expected to witness another failure. They stood very still, watching me walk toward them, with an attention that felt, for the first time since I had arrived at that station, almost uncertain. "You handed the exam back," one of them said, as I stepped into the corridor, my legs unsteady beneath me. "No candidate has ever done that." "I didn't see the point in keeping it," I said, and my voice came out rough, but honest. It wasn't mine to hold on to forever. I answered its question the only way I actually believed in, and once I'd done that, there was nothing left to prove by continuing to sit there and prove it again and again. The two Val exchanged a look I could not fully interpret, something layered and complicated passing between them without a single word spoken aloud, and then the second one spoke, its voice quieter than before. "The exam was built on an assumption that has held for longer than either of us has existed. that a sufficiently developed mind will always attempt to resolve uncertainty before continuing forward. Every species that has faced it has confirmed that assumption. Every single one, until now. Humans never needed that kind of resolution, I said, leaning slightly against the corridor wall, exhaustion finally catching up to me all at once. We've spent our entire history disagreeing with each other about almost everything, and somehow still managing to build things, love people, raise children, and keep moving forward anyway. Uncertainty was never something we solved, it was just something we learned to live inside of. Neither of them answered right away, and we walked the rest of the corridor in a silence that felt, for the first time since I had arrived, almost companionable rather than heavy. Owen was waiting for me at the docking bay when the pod finally returned me to the transport ship, and the moment the doors opened, he was on his feet, crossing the small space between us in 3 quick strides, his relief so plain on his face that it nearly undid the last of my composure. "You're here," he said, gripping my shoulders gently, studying my face the way a doctor studies a patient for signs of injury. "You're actually here, and you're—" He paused, searching my expression carefully. "You're still you." "I'm still me," I confirmed, and my voice cracked slightly on the words, the accumulated weight of everything I had just survived finally settling fully into my chest, now that I was somewhere safe enough to feel it. Barely, but yes, still me. He pulled me into a brief, fierce embrace, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all, and I let myself simply stand there, held, breathing air that felt, for the first time in longer than I could properly measure, entirely and reliably real. News of what had happened moved through the compact faster than I expected, faster, I think, than even Owen had prepared for. Within days, representatives from a dozen different species were requesting formal briefings, some polite and curious, others thinly veiled in their disbelief, a few openly suspicious, murmuring quiet accusations that humanity had somehow found a way to cheat a system that had never once been cheated before. I did not blame them for their suspicion. If I had spent my entire life believing that a mind must resolve a question before it can move past it, and then watched an entire species simply decline to play by that rule and walk away unharmed, I imagine I would have struggled to believe it too. The veil, to their credit, did not try to hide what had happened or explain it away. Their formal report, shared openly across the Compact's archives, described the event with the same careful precision they applied to everything, stating plainly that the exam had been built on a foundational assumption about the nature of advanced minds, and that humanity had revealed, without intending to, a gap in that assumption that no other species had ever exposed. I was asked, more than once, in the weeks that followed, whether I felt proud of what I had done. It is a strange question to sit with, because pride was never quite the feeling that lived inside me afterward. What I felt instead was something quieter and heavier, something closer to a kind of sorrow for every mind, from every species, that had sat in that same chamber before me and never found their way back out whole, not because they were weaker or lesser than me in any way, but simply because they had been built to think in a way that made the exam's trap nearly impossible to see. I thought often, in those weeks, about the two veil in the corridor, about the careful uncertainty in their posture as they watched me walk away from a room that had never let anyone walk away unchanged before. I thought about the voice inside the chamber, patient and ancient and, in its own strange way, almost curious about me by the end, as though it had genuinely never considered the possibility that a mind might simply decline to be caught. Owen asked me, on our final night before the transport ship began its long journey home, what I would tell the next person humanity sent to face something like that exam, if there ever was a next time. I thought about it for a long while before I answered. "I'd tell them not to try to win," I finally said. "Not in the way the exam wants you to win. I'd tell them that every trap like that is built by someone who believes a mind has to resolve every question in front of it before it can take another step forward. And I'd tell them the truest thing I learned in that room, which is that you don't have to solve everything to keep going. You just have to decide, over and over again, that you're still the one deciding." Owen was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the stars beyond the viewport, and then he smiled, tired and genuine. "That's a strange kind of strength." Maybe, I said, but it's ours. And I think in the end, that's exactly why the exam couldn't hold on to it. Months later, long after I had returned home, long after the formal reports had been filed, and the murmurs of suspicion had slowly quieted into something closer to careful respect, I received a message from the Compact Archives, brief and formally worded, informing me that the threshold exam was undergoing its first fundamental revision in longer than recorded history. They did not ask for my permission. They did not need it. But they did ask, quietly, almost humbly, whether I would be willing to help them understand exactly what it was about a human mind that had let me walk out of that chamber before the clock had finished its very first turn. I said yes, of course, not because I wanted the recognition, though I will admit there was a small, quiet part of me that felt something like pride whenever I thought about that request. I said yes because I understood, more clearly than I had ever understood anything before stepping into that chamber, that the real gift I had been given in that room was not a passing grade, or a title, or a place of honor within the compact. It was the simple, unshakable knowledge that the human mind, stubborn and contradictory, and endlessly unwilling to sit still inside anyone else's definition of what a mind is supposed to be, was never actually broken by that exam, because it had never once believed the exam's rules were the only rules worth following. And somewhere out among the stars, in a room built to break minds far older and far more disciplined than mine, an ancient, patient system was finally, slowly, learning to ask a very different kind of question, one built not around certainty, but around the strange, resilient, unpredictable spark that had let one human being simply hand its impossible test back before the clock had even finished ticking.